It was quite interesting watching the buoyant reaction to the news that the band Oasis were going to reform recently, but there was a tinge of pathos with it too. After all, why is it in the modern UK that we have to see Oasis, the Rolling Stones, the Who keep reforming and going on new tours? It seems as if we're lost in the present time and need to look back for a sense of nostalgia, well-being and meaning. What this tells us is that in our present cultural output, there's nothing that unifies a people or defines an age. Instead, we have the homogenized noise of a Taylor Swift or the saccharine music of an Ed Sheeran. I'm sure modern popular artists have the odd catchy tune or two, but do they sum up an era? Do they get the ethos of a people? Not really in my eyes. The second interesting thing is Oasis symbolised a sort of cocky, positive tone in Britain in the 90s. That was something that Tony Blair used to ride to power. Yet now Britain isn't positive, even by Tony Blair's own admission. We live in anxious times. Of course, in stating this, Tony Blair is blissfully unaware that it's he who's caused these anxious times, he and the underlying boomer truth which guided him. Now, when I say boomer truth, I don't mean every single person in the boomer generation. I mean the more social elite in that generation who later dictated the cultural and social policy of the country. Tony Blair is a perfect example of this. Apparently he idolised Mick Jagger when he was growing up and probably had the typical social opinions of anybody of that age. The empire was seen as something universally bad. It split the world apart and peoples apart, and with that came the idea that hierarchy itself is bad. Socially speaking, people of this era's views largely came from the US civil rights movement. They are essentially proto-woke ideals, although admittedly they did have a lot more meat on the bone than they do today. There were obvious examples of racial or social injustice, all encapsulated in quite moving Bob Dylan songs of the era that are the soundtrack of the boomers' ideology. This planted the seeds for many of the establishment assumptions that we suffer under today, the ideas that tolerance is the ultimate virtue, that the so-called quote-unquote other is always virtuous, whereas the problem always lies within you. Now, in some senses, it's very noble to look at your own faults before you critique the world, Christian even. But what about when there are real problems out there in the world and sometimes you're just not to blame? What do you do then? That is a question that the boomer ideology has never truly been able to answer. They just whack on their headphones and crank up the Beatles and ignore the noise coming from the outside. Now, while I don't respect this approach, I can understand it. It's easier to live in the 60s utopia than it is in the reality and the hardships of modern Britain and the mess that we've really made. Yet I think many of us are getting tired of being lectured that every social ill that a minority quote-unquote suffers from is our fault because they're oppressed. Again and again we're told to ignore the evidence of our eyes and ears lest we be evil and stupid and simply believe in the multicultural boomer paradigm of how reality really works. But the more we're lectured about this, the more it seems like an establishment line just to shut people up, and people all the more start to talk about potential group differences and why we have the problems in modern Britain. We notice the endless violence on the streets and are sick of being blamed for it when it's not our fault. We notice the endless mass immigration that we're told to accept with good graces, and every time we say we don't want it, we're just given more. Further to that, we're supposed to endure endless mockery. Here are people on your screen that have been given passports in European countries. They're all mocking the host countries for taking over them and saying that the people there are going to be made minorities. Is this nice? Does this seem like the sort of people you want to welcome in? But if you have a problem with any of this, as you see parts of your own towns and cities disappearing, you're told you're the racist, you're the one that's not welcome in modern Britain, even by supposed conservative MPs. Here's one drinking out of a coconut, referencing a case recently where a woman got away with calling other conservative MPs coconuts because they have brown skin but supposedly white opinions on the inside. Now, I know that there's a woke leftist explanation that this is okay because racism is based upon power, that nonsense that comes from the post-structuralist schools and the academies. However, to the rest of us, this is quite obvious. It's saying bigotry is all well and good for me, but not for thee. But of course, the boomer elite can't see or hear our protestation as they're drowned out by 1970s prog rock. They simply cannot see that they've created a total Frankenstein. Their 1960s social values are no longer really relevant in modern Britain. They might think they are, but what they've turned into is this militant post-structuralist and quite virulent wokeism that seeks to attack the host culture rather than harmonise with it. But for these people, the boomer ideology is all, and they don't realise they've completely sold out the country and are undermining their own belief system. After all, the soft liberalism they so dearly cherish is rooted in the bases of traditionalism and nationalism. Once you remove these two things, it's essentially a meaningless ideology that will get swamped by the next strong political force, be that Islam or a differing ideology like wokeism. And of course, this is why people across the Western world are starting to look to traditionalism on one side and nationalism on the other, sometimes a combination of the two. Of course, the boomers just call them evil and ignorant without realising it's them that have pushed them down that path. People feel they have to do this because they're looking for their foundations, their coordinates in the modern world. They can see that the boomer paradigm is wrong and it's ending. Of course, the elites and the sheltered are totally mystified by this, but they don't see that they're dying out too, leaving in their wake the battle of our age. This is the battle we're seeing the beginnings of now. It's the unholy blend of globalist utopian elitism, along with their mass immigration and brainwashed masses, versus tradition, nation, people, God. This is why even once leftist radicals like Russell Brand are turning to tradition and Christianity. This is the battle of the 21st century, the World Economic Forum man versus the ancient way. And it's my belief we're all needed in this battle. We can all do our little bit. What we need to do is become all the more rooted in our great ancient tradition, spiritually, personally, and politically. And on top of that, work on our own health, physical, social, communal. Why we need this is because great change happens when people are driven by something true and just and healthy and positive. So while the modern world seems to be pushing this fast entertainment which keeps you occupied and fast food culture, we should seek to do the opposite, to get into true health, to connect with our land and the rhythms of nature. It's my belief that the reawakening of this collective soul in truth, justice and beauty will buttress the Western world against the oncoming storm of globalism. These are just my thoughts, however. Do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel.